In 1674, workmen dug up 2 juvenile skeletons at the foot of a staircase in the Tower of London. It was believed that the mysterious disappearance of a 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard, the Duke of York, had finally been solved. But had it really? Well, today we're going to take a look at the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the tower. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other historical mysteries you would like to hear about. Okay, time for an episode of Forensic Files, Medieval Edition. After Edward IV died, his young son, conveniently named Edward V, became king. But within a few short months, both Edward and his brother Richard had disappeared without a trace. When their uncle, Richard III, claimed the crown in 1483, everyone assumed he whacked the boys to seize power. And if you've brushed up on your Shakespeare, you know Tricky Dicky was the kind of guy who would do something like that. But that doesn't mean he actually did the deed. Both of the skeletons found in the tower showed evidence of a rare genetic anomaly called hypodontia, or congenitally missing teeth. Experts previously believed this proved their identity, as they supposedly inherited the condition from their grandmother, Cecily, Duchess of York. But historian John Ashdown Hill analyzed the remains and found King Richard didn't actually possess that genetic anomaly. Given he was the son of Cecily and the uncle of the princes, it was curious he didn't share the trait. And based on that genetic evidence, it is unlikely Richard was related to the 2 skeletons, or whomever they belonged to. But that didn't stop folks from speculating. Author Sir Thomas More wrote a detailed account of the murders of Edward and Richard in his 1,535-page Turner, The History of King Richard III. In More's account, Richard put Sir James Tyrrell, one of his close advisors, in charge of dispatching his nephews. Tyrrell, apparently not looking to get his own hands dirty, ordered his horsekeeper, John Dighton, and tower guard Miles Forrest to carry out the act. A study published in December 2020 speculated that the previous unknown sources of these details might have been Forrest's own sons, Edward and Miles Jr., who would have had access to more and, therefore, ample opportunity to spill the beans. You really can't trust anyone these days, or in the days of the 15th century. Now, one examination could provide the key to this 500-year-old mystery. The remains of Richard III himself. Discovered under a parking lot in 2012, King Richard's DNA could conclusively prove the family connection, lending credence to the theory he murdered his nephews. On the other hand, his DNA could also disprove the remains belonged to the princes, creating more questions about what really happened to the missing boys, and providing a totally anticlimactic finale, like Elf. The remains of those found in the tower were last examined in 1933, at which point it was allegedly confirmed they belonged to the princes. But as every CSI fan knows, forensic science has made significant advances in the last 90 years. The initial conjecture was based on the presence of unfused bones, baby teeth, and the estimated ages of the remains, but not much else. Modern scientists say little can conclusively be proven by simply looking at bones, and with juvenile skeletons, there's nothing to indicate the sex of the remains, meaning they're not even necessarily male. They may not even be princes. The scandal. However, DNA analysis could discover a family connection and the sex of the remains, while radiocarbon dating would determine approximately when the children died. So, all we need to do is call David Caruso, right? Well, those party poopers at the Church of England have repeatedly refused to let this happen. The Dean of Westminster denied requests to analyze the remains, on the grounds that it would lead to other royal exhumations. He also reasoned a scientific inquiry could not truly solve the mystery, as it would not identify the guilty party. And if the remains proved not to be those of the princes, it would also leave the church with the problem of what to do with the unidentified bodies. In other words, if we try to get this right, people will try to get other things right, and that would be a royal pain in the ass. Experts who examined the remains in 1933 concluded the cause of death was suffocation, based on brown stains on one of the skulls, said to be the result of blood pooling in the face during smothering. This would match the popular version of events in which the princes were smothered with a pillow. An intriguingly lurid theory for a true crime documentary, sure, but modern scientists tend to disagree. In fact, in 1955, Other doctors examined photographs of the remains and concluded not only were the stains caused by decomposition rather than suffocation, but that the remains themselves seemed to be from children younger than the princes when they disappeared. And the plot, like our intrigue, thickens. During the 1933 investigation, scientists determined the age of the remains, and their determination has been a huge factor in perpetuating the belief that the bones indeed belonged to the lost princes. But they were really just guesstimating. Several of the bones remained unfused, allowing them to estimate age by looking at which ones weren't fully grown. A dental analysis also confirmed the existence of baby teeth. These factors allowed them to approximate one child was 12 or 13 years old when he perished, and the other was just a few years younger. This aligns with the ages of the young princes, as Edward would have been 12 and Richard around 9 when they disappeared. But what of those 1955 doctors who placed the remains as being younger? Well, unless the Church of England pulls a 180 and starts letting people dig up some kings, it'll all just be grim guesstimations. Richard III often gets blamed for the murder of his nephews, which Richard himself never confirmed or denied. That's kind of an admission right there. But many historians posit that if Richard did dispatch his nephews, displaying the bodies rather than hiding them in the tower would have made much more sense. This isn't something that was done just for the sake of being cruel. The purpose was to prevent anyone from coming forward and claiming to be one of the missing princes, thereby jeopardizing Richard's claim to the throne, which is exactly what happened. A popular pretender to the throne, Perkin Warbeck, came out of the woodwork a number of years later, claiming he was actually the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York. He was even recognized as Prince Richard by Margaret of York, Richard III's sister. But eventually, the jig was up, and Warbeck confessed and was executed by King Henry VII in 1499. Had the bodies been publicly displayed, this attempted uprising might not have occurred. What's that saying about Monday morning quarterbacks? Oh, right. They hang skeletons real good. In a wild postscript to this story, many historians now believe Warbeck may really have been Prince Richard. Probably should have stayed in hiding, Rick. According to Sir Thomas More's The History of King Richard III, in 1502, Sir James Tyrrell, a trusted knight of Richard III, confessed to slaying the young princes while under extreme duress, which is a polite way of saying he was tortured. This was a commonly used method to gain information from people, but such confessions are almost always questionable, since admissions of guilt are often given just to make the torture stop. Nonetheless, it's one of the few pieces of evidence linking Richard to the alleged crime. Tyrrell's confession stated the bodies were buried at the foot of a staircase in the Tower of London, before being moved to a more dignified location on Richard's order. The bodies were, in fact, found near the foot of a staircase, making Tyrrell's confession partially correct. Tyrrell's confession is not mentioned in any other sources, however, and the original document was never discovered. Pix or it didn't happen, Sir Thomas More. After the death of Richard III and the end of the War of Roses, Henry Tudor took the throne as Henry VII. Shortly thereafter, he married the missing prince's sister, Elizabeth of York. In the years leading up to the wedding, there was debate whether the princes and Elizabeth were illegitimate. Henry had the princes and Elizabeth declared legitimate heirs to strengthen Elizabeth's claim to the throne, which was really just strengthening his own claim. But even though it benefited him to prove Richard was responsible for their deaths, Henry launched no investigation into the case. Historians speculate Henry feared either uncovering his own connection to the murder or finding out the princes were still alive. If the princes were alive, that would mean Henry wasn't rightfully king, and he'd already moved in all his stuff. To that end, Henry made a point to execute the fake but possibly real Prince Perkin Warbeck in 1499, remember him, to discourage any other would-be pretenders. Despite the legends, many historians believe the princes weren't murdered at all. After all, no actual evidence existed of any crime. The princes simply vanished without a trace. Contemporary rumors circulated that the princes were whacked, which would have reflected poorly on Richard III. But Richard remained silent on the matter, neither declaring the boys dead, proclaiming his innocence, or admitting the boys were still alive. His silence persisted even when rumors sparked talk of rebellion. So, here's the big question. If the princes hadn't been taken out, why did they vanish? And where did they go? One theory says that Richard III hid the young royals away for their safety. And indeed, the political climate of the time was incredibly dangerous. Richard himself died in battle just 2 years later at the height of the War of Roses. If his aim was to protect the princes from the violence of the era, it could explain his silence on the matter. But of course, history is written by the victors, or in this case, the Henrys. And with Richard dead, King Henry VII was able to write things as he saw fit. Not surprisingly, much of the evidence for the alleged crime is biased in favor of Henry Tudor. For example, Sir Thomas More's history, which included Tyrrell's suspicious and unverified confession, was written during Henry's reign. And while Henry declared the princes dead, their bodies were nowhere to be found, which proved similarly convenient for the king. A century later, William Shakespeare wrote his play Richard III, popularizing the image of the king as a murderous villain. Not coincidentally, the ruler of England at the time was Queen Elizabeth I, granddaughter of Henry VII, and the last of the Tudor dynasty. And regardless of what the bard really believed, casting doubt on the Queen's ancestors would not have been a great move. Whatever the reason he created it, Shakespeare's version of Richard III is the one history remembers. And while it doesn't solve the mystery of the princes in the tower, it does prove the old saying, don't be the villain of a Shakespeare play. So what do you think? What really happened to the princes in the tower? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.